Welcome to Swayam MOOC course NGOs and Sustainable Development, Unit 3, Module 22, Nuclear Resources and Legal Regulation of Hazardous Substances. Learning Objectives. By the end of this module, you will be able to understand about nuclear resources and the process for getting energy, comprehend the various laws, rules, regulations of hazardous substances. Now let us see what is nuclear energy. A type of energy emitted by an atom's nucleus which is composed of protons and neutrons is called nuclear energy. The electrons go around the orbit as shown in the picture. Nuclear energy resources. The metal uranium is present in rocks all across the globe. There are numerous naturally occurring isotopes of uranium, which are variations of the element with the same chemical composition but different mass and physical characteristics. Uranium is the fuel most widely used to produce nuclear energy. That's because uranium atoms split apart relatively very easily. Uranium is also a very common element found in the rocks all across the globe. The two original isotopes of uranium are uranium 238 and uranium 235. Uranium 238 makes up the majority of the uranium found in the world but cannot produce a fission chain reaction. Uranium 235 can be used to produce the fission but constitutes less than 1% of the world's uranium. It is necessary to raise the amount of uranium 235 in a given sample by a procedure known as uranium enrichment in order to improve the likelihood that natural uranium can undergo fission. After uranium has been enhanced, it can be used as a nuclear fuel in power plants for 3 to 5 years because only then it becomes radioactive and it needs to be disposed of in accordance with the strict regulations laid down by the governments, the regulatory bodies. This is essential to safeguard people as well as the environment. Additionally, the spent fuel, also known as the used fuel, can be recycled into a new fuel, and this can be used in specialized nuclear power reactors. Now let us see the methods of getting this energy from nuclear. Electricity can be produced using nuclear energy, but it first needs to be released from the atom. This source of energy can be produced in two ways. One is through fission and the second is through fusion. As the name indicates, fission is when the nuclei of the atom splits up into several parts. Fusion, in other words, is joining together, is when the nuclei fuse together. So, in nuclear fission, we see a large atom gets broken into smaller atoms, and in this process it releases enormous amount of energy, while nuclear fusion is when smaller atoms join together to come out with a bigger atom, a larger atom, and even during that process energy is released, and from that we get electricity. So, fission is a method of releasing nuclear energy by controlled nuclear fission in devices called reactors, which now operate in many parts of the world for producing electricity. Fusion is a method of obtaining nuclear energy through controlled nuclear fusion. Nuclear energy has been released explosively by both nuclear fusion and nuclear fission. Nuclear fission, let us see in detail. When an atom, such as one made up of uranium or plutonium, undergoes nuclear fission, its nucleus splits into two lighter nuclei having nearly equal mass. As shown in the picture, we find how the nuclear fission happens, and there is the atom gets broken, and in this process enormous amount of energy is released, as well as smaller neutrons are also released. When the nucleus is excited by a variety of particles such as neutrons, protons, deuterons or alpha particles, or by electromagnetic radiation in the form of gamma rays, the process may occur spontaneously or it has to be induced. A significant amount of energy is released, radioactive byproducts are created, and several neutrons are discharged during the fission process. These neutrons have the ability to trigger the fission of nearby fissionable materials nucleus and then release more neutrons that can keep repeating the process, setting off a chain reaction in which a large amount of fissionable nuclei keeps splitting and tremendous amount of energy gets released, and this is a continuous chain reaction process. If controlled in a nuclear reactor, such a chain reaction can provide power for the society's benefit. Energy is released in the form of heat as well as radiation each time this fission happens. Similar to how heat comes from fossil fuels like coal, oil, natural gas, and that heat is used to produce electricity, the heat from the nuclear power plants can also be transformed into electricity. Uncontrolled use, as with so-called atomic bomb, can result in explosion, and it has a very destructive power. Now let us see what is nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is when smaller atoms come together and a large atom is formed, and in this process also energy is released. So, nuclear fusion is the process through which nuclear reactions between lighter elements produce heavier atoms, and this is known as nuclear fusion. Significant amount of energy is generated when interacting nuclei from low atomic number elements such as hydrogen, whose atomic number is 1, or its isotopes deuterium and tritium are involved. Thermonuclear weapons, often known as hydrogen bombs, were created in the decade immediately following the World War II, and they were first put to use to produce tremendous energy. This is obtained from nuclear fusion. An enormous effort has been made to harness nuclear fusion for the generation of power due to the potential peaceful application of the process and virtually infinite availability of fusion fuel on the earth. The necessary parameters for plasma temperature, heat insulation have largely been met, despite the fact that operational fusion reactors have not yet been constructed, indicating the fusion energy for the generation of electric power is a real possibility. Commercial fusion reactors promise a never-ending supply of electricity for every nation. So, now let us see how does a nuclear power plant work. So, as the picture indicates, the various parts are mentioned. So, the nuclear reactor is the place where the reaction takes place, the nuclear fission takes place, and when the nuclear fission takes place, enormous amount of heat is generated. There is a cooling water pumped into this reactor, and this water absorbs the heat and takes it to the turbine, and this heat in the form of steam is used to run the turbine, and from the turbine it goes to the generator, and from the generator we get electricity which is transmitted to the grid. The hot water or the warm water that is obtained in the nuclear reactor is then taken for a cooling purposes. It is cooled and again pumped back to the reactor. So, this is how the nuclear power plant works. A collection of devices that can control the nuclear fission is used to generate electricity, and this system is called the nuclear reactor or the power plant. Uranium pellets are the fuel that the nuclear reactors utilize to generate nuclear fission. Atoms of uranium-235 are driven to disintegrate in the nuclear reactor. The atoms split, releasing little particles known as fission particles. Other uranium atoms break as a result of fission products, beginning a chain reaction. This chain reaction releases energy which is converted into heat. Nuclear fission generates heat which warms the cooling fluid of the reactor. Normal cooling agents include water, but some nuclear reactors also use molten salt or liquid metal. Steam is created when the cooling agent is heated by nuclear fusion. Turbines or wheels are turned by flowing river that are rotated by the steam that comes from the nuclear reactor. Generators or engines that produce the energy are driven by the turbines, and the generator then transforms this energy into electricity, which is transmitted to the grid. The first nuclear reactor to produce electricity was located near Arco in Idaho. In 1951, the experimental breeder reactor started supplying its own energy. In Russia, Obninsk, the first nuclear power plant created specifically to supply energy to a town, was built in 1954. High-tech materials are needed to construct the nuclear reactors, and only nations that have ratified the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty are able to obtain the necessary uranium or plutonium. These factors account for the majority of the nuclear power facilities being found in wealthy nations. About 200 tons of uranium are used annually in a typical nuclear reactor. Some uranium and plutonium can be re-enriched or recycled thanks to the recent sophisticated procedures. The amount of mining, extracting and processing required has come down because of the recycling that has been taking place. Electricity generated by the nuclear energy can be utilized in commercial establishments such as hotels, hospitals, organizations, and as well as in residential areas like homes, schools, etc. Now, what are the benefits of using nuclear energy? Nuclear energy facilities are considered to be clean, renewable energy in some instances. They do not release greenhouse gases or harm the environment. They do not significantly impact their surroundings and can be developed in both urban as well as rural areas. However, with all its benefits, there are certain factors that needs to be considered, which are the nuclear byproducts. A group of atomic nuclei that are unstable make up the radioactive material. These nuclei lose energy and have an impact on a variety of substances, including living things and the environment. So, in spite of being a clean energy, and in some instances because the fuel can be recycled, it can be treated as a renewable energy, yet the amount of hazards it can cause in case there is going to be an explosion or in case there is going to be a leak is enormous. Particles that are released from the nuclei as a result of nuclear instability are referred to as radioactive substances. The byproduct of the nuclear energy is radioactive material. What's left over after a nuclear reactor has resulted in radioactive waste. Most preventive gear worn by employees, the tools and other items that has come in contact with the radioactive dust are also considered as radioactive waste. Radioactive trash is persistent, so the clothing, the tools can retain their radioactivity for a very long period of time. So, people working in the nuclear power plants have to be aware, conscious of all these things. In order to prevent contamination of other materials, the government controls how these items need to be disposed of, how workers have to work within the nuclear power plant. Nuclear rods and used fuels are very radioactive. Used uranium pellets need to be kept in unique containers that resemble sizable swimming pools. Water cools the fuel and shields the outside from radioactive contact. Some nuclear power stations store their old fuel sometimes above the ground in dry storage tanks. Nuclear power plant operations, however, result in radioactive waste with varied levels of activity. Depending on the level of radioactivity and the purpose, they need to be handled differently, carefully. Extremely toxic substance can result in burns, raise the risk of blood disorders, malignancies, and also bone degeneration. So, government has come out with various regulations, laws to protect human as well as the environment. They have also laid down principles on how the hazardous substances need to be handled. So, nuclear power, with the emergence of nuclear power came in the environmental concerns, and environmental concerns led to legislations. The growth of nuclear energy as a response of the oil crisis which happened during the 1970s, early 1970s as well as late 1970s, was eventually responsible for raising the awareness of long-term health and environmental effects on the global scale. The Stockholm Conference in 1972 had asked for a registry of radioactive emissions and global cooperation on the disposal and reprocessing of the radioactive waste. Although it was acknowledged that the latter was a rising issue brought on by the increased use of nuclear power, it provided no specific policy recommendations or directions. Nuclear waste ocean dumping was partially outlawed in 1972 and was halted completely in 1983 and was totally outlawed in 1996 protocol, modifying the London Dumping Convention, leaving only land disposal or reprocessing as the practical options. The threats that nuclear power poses to human health, agriculture and environment were, however, made obvious by the nuclear reactor accidents that happened at 3 Mile Island in the United States, the Chernobyl accident which happened in the Soviet Union. The Chernobyl accident in 1986 exposed some of the true cause of nuclear power as well as the limitations of international strategy for containing catastrophic hazards by dispersing the pollution which spread over a large area, both Eastern as well as Eastern Europe. The effectiveness of national and international regulation of nuclear facilities has been questioned since the Chernobyl accident. It demonstrated how constrained the International Atomic Energy Agency IAEA authority was and how little consensus there was about issues of state accountability and liability. It gave the right to quick notification of dangerous incidents, the chances for consultation on safety concerns, the interest of neighboring states in the location of nuclear power plants had new relevance. It became clear that by 1950 humanitarian perspective of the nuclear power needed to place greater emphasis on tighter international regulation which took care of safety issues of mankind as well as the environment. Now, what are treated as hazardous substances and on what are these regulations based on? Hazardous wastes are wastes that, if improperly stored, transported, processed or disposed of, constitute a harm to human health or the environment when it is present in sufficient amount or concentration. Flammables, explosives, heavy metals like lead, arsenic, mercury, petroleum fuel byproducts, deadly microorganisms, several synthetic chemical compounds like the DDT and toxins, dioxins are examples of hazardous materials. According to the report which Greenpeace published, getting the data between 1986 and 1988, industrialized nations exported over 3 million tons of waste to poor nations as they became concerned about the dangers of toxin waste, and this was at the expense of the developing nations. In this process, the developing nations were treated as garbage cans. Exposure to toxic substances may cause acute or chronic health effects. Acute effects, which can range in severity from rashes to death, manifest quickly when there is a high level of exposure. Low level of exposure causes chronic effects, which typically include birth deformities, miscarriages, lung and respiratory disorders, neurological damage, neurological system damage, among several other health hazards. Then came in the Basel Convention on Control of Hazardous Waste. The Basel Convention on Control of Hazardous Waste took place during March 22nd, 1989 in Basel, Switzerland. The United Nations Environment Programme UNEP was established in 1987. The waste that was covered by the Basel Convention include the toxicity, the corrosivity, ignitability, reactivity, ecotoxicity, clinical waste, mining waste, industrial waste, agricultural waste, end of life equipments. All these were covered in the Basel Convention, and how to treat these wastes were also presented. Making environmentally appropriate management a requirement for any trans-boundary transportation of waste was the goal. At least 50% of the people who attended this convention were participants from developing nations. A model set of rules for the responsible management of the trans-boundary flow of hazardous waste and chemicals was talked during the Basel Convention. Each member to the convention is required to enact domestic legislation in accordance with the rules that they had discussed. One of the most significant decisions that was made in the Basel Convention is that they need to immediately forbid the shipment of any hazardous materials or hazardous waste from the OECD countries to the non-OECD states, and this was carried out to ensure the final disposal was taken care of through these legislations. Additionally, the transboundary movement of hazardous waste from OECD to non-OECD government for recycling or recovery operation was expected to be phased out during December 1997. The Basel Convention, however, does not prohibit the export of hazardous waste to poor nations. On the contrary, it grants permission as long as the parties adhere to its requirement and limitations. It requires the parties to take all reasonable measures to guarantee that the trans-boundary movement of the hazardous waste is carried out in a way that will safeguard the public health as well as the environment from any negative impacts that such movement can cause. Following the Bhopal gas tragedy in 1984, the Indian government reviewed its policies regarding the waste management and disposal of hazardous materials, and in 1986 it passed the Environment Protection Act. As per this Act, Section 3, the central government is empowered to take action to safeguard and enhance the environment under Section 3 of the Environment Protection Act. Section 3(2), the central government is expressly given the authority to take any and all actions that it deems necessary to establish procedures and safety precautions for handling hazardous chemicals, and this comes under Section 3(2). By using the authority granted by Section 6, 8 and 25 of the Environment Protection Act of 1986, the central government established the Hazardous Waste Management Rules of 1989 to control waste. Section 2(e) of the Environment Protection Act of 1986, it deals a hazardous substance is any substance or preparation that has the potential to harm human beings or other living things, plants, microorganisms, property or the environment due to its chemical or physiochemical qualities or because of handling. These standards include specific guidelines for managing the dangerous substances. The central government must take into account the substance danger level and the potential for harm to the environment, the people and other living things before allowing it handled by the common man in a certain location. The government must also consider if an alternate is readily available or whether the technology is required to build one is available. Thus, before making judgments about the prohibition or restriction of handling the dangerous substances, the government is expected to take all the factors into consideration and lay down the rules and regulations. On 24th September 2008, the Hazardous Waste Management Handling Rules of 1989 was superseded by the Hazardous Waste Management Handling and Transboundary Movement Rules. This was an amendment, and this new rule was done in 2009. Besides the rules issued under the Environment Act of 1986, provisions touching on the regulation of hazardous substances are contained in the Explosive Substances Act of 1908, the Indian Petroleum Act of 1934, the Inflammable Substance Act of 1952, the Factories Act of 1948, as well as it is covered in the Insecticides Act of 1968 and the rules of 1971, as well as there is a separate Atomic Act which was formulated in 1962. The National Environment Tribunal Act of 1995 establishes strict accountability for any damages that is resulting from an accident while handling hazardous material. The Biomedical Waste Management and Handling Rules of 1998 includes how to handle biomedical waste. Similar to this, the Public Liability Insurance Act of 1991 addresses the compensation for anyone who is hurt by the business which is running hazardous or dangerous goods. However, the Hazardous Waste Management and Handling Rules of 1989 state these rules will not apply to radioactive waste as per the Rule 2E. Radioactive wastes are covered under the Atomic Energy Act of 1962. Some of the acts and regulations relating to nuclear energy in India are the Atomic Energy Act of 1962, the Atomic Energy Working of the Mines, Minerals and Handling of Prescribed Substances Rules of 1984, the Atomic Energy Safe Disposal of Radioactive Waste Rules of 1987, the Atomic Energy Factory Rules of 1996, Radiation Protection Rules of 2004, Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act 2010, Notification of Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Rules of 2011. So, these are the various acts that talks about nuclear energy, how we handle the radioactive waste, how do we handle hazardous waste. The IAEA has laid down certain principles to be followed by its member states for nuclear safety and precautions. The safety principle, the security principle, responsibility principle, permission principle, continuous control principle, compensation principle, as well as sustainable development principle, compliance principle, independence principle, transparency principle, international cooperation principle. Now, Hazardous Waste Management and Handling Rules of 1989 was formulated under the Environment Protection Act of 1986. This was amended during 2000 and again it was amended during 2003. These rules are framed under the enabling provisions of the Environment Protection Act of 1986. They apply to designated categories of waste as specified in the schedule, example cyanide waste, waste from dyes, etc. A few of the most important rules that is present are under Rule 2, we have the wastewater and exhaust gas which is covered under the Water Act or the Air Act. Under Rule 4, a person who produces hazardous trash in great amounts must take all necessary precautions to handle and dispose it properly. Under Rule 5, the State Pollution Control Board permit system which is outlined in Rule 5 is how hazardous wastes are handled and disposed of. No one is allowed to collect, receive, process, transport, store or dispose hazardous materials without the State Pollution Control Board's permission. Rule 7 talks about hazardous waste must be transported and packaged with labels. Rule 8 talks about state governments are required to compile a list of disposal locations. Rule 11 talks about hazardous waste cannot be imported into India for dumping or disposal. So, India has laid down this rule so that it cannot become a dumping site for developed nations. The rules did not forbid the import of hazardous waste into India for recycling until January 2000, and a significant amount of rubbish entered India in 1997 as a result of this loophole. In response to a writ suit submitted by the Research Foundation for Science and Technology and Natural Resource Policy, the Supreme Court banned the import as a measure in May 1997. A committee was established by the court in October 1997 to thoroughly investigate every aspect of hazardous waste and provide a report along with its recommendations. The hazardous waste rules of 1989 underwent extensive revision thanks to the Centre's introduction in January 2000. The modifications reinforced the current permit system, expand the application of rules to previously unregulated activities and wastes, zinc and lead wastes, and added new restrictions to limit the import and export of hazardous waste for recycling or for reuse. The nodal body for approving the transboundary movement of hazardous waste is the Union Ministry of Environment and Forests. Hazardous Chemicals Manufacture, Storage and Import Rules of 1989. The Central Department of Environment, Forests and Wildlife created these regulations, which are applicable to businesses that use or store particular hazardous chemicals. These regulations were created in order to establish accountability for handling, implementing appropriate preventive measures during manufacture, storage and transportation, as well as for importing any hazardous chemicals. According to the rules, the district collector or another designated authority is expected to create off-site emergency plans to contain serious chemical mishaps, and the central and the state pollution control boards are required to implement government instructions and procedures. The occupier who oversees the industrial activity is in charge of creating and updating the on-site emergency plans. Additionally, the occupant must regularly submit updated safety reports to the authority. Hazardous chemical imports are kept under control by enforcing requirements for disclosure of chemical information and appropriate safety precautions during offloading. To improve the administrative response to accidents involving hazardous substances, the Chemical Accidents, Emergency Planning, Preparedness and Response Rules were published in 1996. These regulations add to the 1989 Hazardous Chemical Regulation. According to the rules, crisis groups must be established at the federal, state, municipal and district levels to handle chemical mishaps. The Hazardous Chemical Rules of 1989 was revised by the central government in January 2000. They amended the schedules, including the addition of a revised list of hazardous substances. It was redefined major accident, established new criteria to identify poisonous compounds, flammable chemicals, explosives, and included fresh parameters. Additionally, it stipulated that safety audits in large accident danger units were required. Next, coming to hazardous microorganisms rule, which came into force during 1989. In October 1993, these regulations came into effect. They controlled the production, consumption, import, export and storage of dangerous microorganisms and the cells or organisms. The Environment Act of 1986, Section 6 and 25 as well as Section 8, which governs the handling of hazardous substances, were used to draft the rules. The regulation is created via a system of oversight, review and control by various bodies. Microorganisms handling, production and usage are forbidden absent authorization from the Genetic Engineering Approval Committee. Next, coming to Biomedical Waste Management and Handling Rules of 1998. All individuals who produce, collect, receive, store, transport, process, dispose or manage biomedical waste in any way are subject to follow a set of guidelines. 10 categories of biomedical waste, which are stated in the rules schedule, are to be separated, packaged and disposed according to the regulations. The rule mandates that it shall be the duty of every occupier of an institution generating the biomedical waste, which includes a hospital, a nursing home, clinic, a dispensary, a veterinary institution, animal house, pathology laboratory, blood bank, etc. all need to take all the steps stipulated, and the waste have to be disposed as given by the guidelines. No untreated biomedical waste may be retained in storage for more than 48 hours. Despite the existence of several regulations governing dangerous compounds, they are not effectively put into practice. Additionally, the nation lacks the fundamental knowledge or information regarding the nature, traits and effects of the hazardous compounds and its effect on the environment as well as human health. For efficient implementation and enforcement of hazardous waste standards, increased understanding regarding the nature of the hazardous waste must be conveyed. So, now let us see some questions and answers related to this topic. Who regulates the nuclear power plants in India? The Atomic Energy Regulatory Board, called the AERB, is the national authority for ensuring that the use of ionizing radiation and nuclear energy does not cause any undue risk to the health of workers, members of the public or to the environment. AERB is responsible for the stipulation and enforcement of the rules and regulations pertaining to nuclear and radiological safety. Question 2. Which of the states in US have banned nuclear power plants? 12 states currently have restrictions on the construction of new nuclear power facilities in US. They are California, Connecticut, Hawaii, Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, Minnesota, New Jersey, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island and Vermont. Having said this, we should understand that US has the most operational nuclear reactors in this earth. They have 96 nuclear power plants. Together, they have a capacity of 97,565 megawatt installed capacity, and the nuclear energy that is generated and being consumed is 20% of the total country's electricity generation. So, the reason is, how do we protect the nuclear power plants from terrorist attack if it so happens? Because once the nuclear power plant, there is a leakage or if there is an explosion, what measures are we going to take is a question that has caused countries to ban installation of nuclear power plants. Question 3. Can nuclear waste be recycled? Yes, of course, nuclear waste is recyclable. Once the nuclear fuel uranium or thorium is used in a reactor, it can be treated and put into another reactor as fuel. In fact, typical reactors only extract a few % of the energy in their fuel. To summarize, in this module, we have understood about nuclear resources and the process for getting energy and in turn electricity. We have comprehended the various laws, rules, legislations of handling hazardous substances. Thank you.